We begin, as we always do, with the truth plainly spoken. She was 42 years old, penniless, and standing on a splintered dock with nothing but a carpetbag and a debt she did not owe. Her name would come to matter to an entire town before the year was through, but on that gray morning in the autumn of 1889, she was simply a woman nobody wanted. Her late husband's brother, a hard, calculating man named Elias Whitfield, had stood in the doorway of the house she had scrubbed and mended and loved for 15 years, and told her that the deed had always been his, that grief did not entitle her to charity, and that she had until sundown to be gone. She left with $11 sewn into her hem, a Bible that had belonged to her mother, and the particular kind of silence that settles over a person who has lost everything twice in one lifetime. 3 days later, in the fishing town of Gullhaven, perched on the wind-scoured cliffs of the Oregon coast, she heard that the county was selling off an old, blind lighthouse that no ship trusted anymore. Abandoned, they said, cursed, they whispered, for the price of $4. It seemed a fool's purchase, a joke the town told about itself. But sealed away in a lantern room at the top of that crumbling tower was something that would not only rebuild her life, but would settle a debt 50 years old and restore a whole community's faith in what it means to be seen. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Whitfield. If you're watching this from a town that people forgot, or a place that once mattered and stopped mattering to everyone but you, tell us in the comments. We would love to know where you are watching from tonight. Clara had not always been a woman who counted coins twice before spending them. She had been raised 40 miles inland, in a valley town called Marrow's Bend, the second of 4 daughters born to a lighthouse keeper's widow herself. A stern, capable woman named Agnes Reyes, who had taught her girls that the difference between poverty and ruin was whether or not you knew how to fix things with your own hands. Agnes had kept the family fed through 2 bad harvests by mending nets for the coastal fleets, by canning what other households threw away, by reading the sky the way other people read newspapers. Clara, the quietest of the 4, had been the one who sat beside her mother longest, who learned to splice rope until her fingers bled and calloused over, who learned the old system of lighthouse signal flags because her mother had grown up in a keeper's cottage and refused to let the knowledge die with her. It was, Agnes always said, a foolish thing to teach a daughter who would likely marry a farmer and never see the ocean again. But knowledge carried no weight to spare, Agnes insisted, and a woman never knew which skill would someday be the only thing standing between her and the dark. At 19, Clara had married Thomas Whitfield, a gentle, sun-brown man who ran cattle and grew wheat on a modest spread outside a town called Cedar Hollow, and for 15 years her life had been full in the ordinary, unremarkable way that people only recognize as extraordinary once it is gone. They had no children who lived past infancy, a grief the 2 of them carried together in a silence that was tender rather than cold, and they had built instead a life of small rituals, Sunday bread, mended fences, letters to her sisters, Thomas whistling off-key while he worked. Thomas had a brother, Elias, older by 6 years, who had left for the gold fields of California as a young man and returned only occasionally, always leaner, always harder, always speaking of debts and schemes and men who had wronged him. Thomas, out of a loyalty Clara privately thought excessive, had co-signed notes for his brother more than once, had forgiven loans that were never repaid, had insisted that blood meant something even when Elias made it plain that to him it meant very little at all. Clara had watched this pattern for over a decade, with the particular helplessness of a wife who loves her husband's goodness, even while fearing where it will lead them. She kept her own quiet insurance against disaster, a tin box hidden beneath a floorboard, into which she placed the odd coin from selling preserves at market, money that was hers alone, money Thomas did not know existed because she suspected, rightly as it turned out, that he would have found some brother-shaped reason to spend it. It was not distrust exactly. It was the old lesson from her mother, worn smooth with repetition. A woman should always know how to stand on her own, even inside a marriage built on love. That instinct, more than any single object, would prove to be the true inheritance Agnes Reyes left her daughter, more valuable in the end than any lighthouse, any ledger, any sum of money sealed behind old glass. Thomas died in the spring of 1889, thrown from a spooked horse on a rain-slicked trail, and Clara's grief was the kind that hollows a person out slowly, over weeks, rather than all at once. She was still moving through the fog of it, still setting 2 cups at breakfast some mornings before she remembered, when Elias arrived at the ranch with a lawyer from the county seat and a folded document that named him, and him alone, as the rightful heir to the land. Clara had never seen the paper before. She would later learn, though far too late to matter, that Thomas had signed it years earlier as collateral against one of his brother's schemes, trusting, as he trusted everything, that it would never actually be called due. Elias called it due within a month of burying his brother. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply stood in her kitchen, the kitchen where she had fed him more times than she could count, and told her that grief did not entitle her to charity, that the house and the land and everything in it belonged to him now, and that he expected her gone by sundown. She did not argue. There is a particular dignity, we think, in knowing when arguing will only feed a cruelty rather than end it, and Clara had learned that dignity from a mother who had survived worse. She packed what fit in a single carpet bag, her mother's Bible, a photograph of Thomas taken on their wedding day, the tin box from beneath the floorboard which held, when she finally counted it with trembling hands on the porch of a stranger's boarding house 3 nights later, exactly $11.40. It was not enough to buy passage back east to her sister's. It was not enough to rent a room in Cedar Hollow for more than a fortnight. Not that she wished to stay in a town that had watched Elias take everything and said nothing. So she did what women without options have always done. She moved toward the one direction that seemed to offer something other than certain defeat. She had heard, from a peddler passing through, that the coastal towns to the west were hungry for capable hands, that the fishing communities paid decent wages to women who could mend nets and preserve fish and keep a boarding house running. And that land was cheap on that wind-battered stretch of coast because so few people wanted to live where the fog never fully lifted. Cheap land, to a woman with $11, sounded like the only kind of hope still available to her. She arrived in Gullhaven on a gray Tuesday morning, stepping off a lumber wagon that had given her passage in exchange for mending the driver's torn coat along the way. And she found a town smaller and more tired than she had pictured. A huddle of clapboard buildings pressed between dark pine hills and a churning gray sea, its docks half empty of boats. Its main street quiet in the particular way of places that had once expected more of themselves. She took a room at the town's one boarding house, run by a warm, weathered widow named Bess Calloway, on the promise of 2 days' labor to cover it, and it was Bess, over a supper of fish stew and hard bread, who first told her about the lighthouse. It stood on Grieving Point, a rocky spur of land a mile north of town, and it had not held a working light in nearly 9 years. The old keeper, a solitary man named Josiah Wren, had died there alone in the winter of 1880, and no one had wanted the post since. The salary was small, the isolation total, and there were stories, the kind towns tell about places they have quietly given up on, that the tower was unlucky, that ships still wrecked on the rocks below it more often than any lighthouse ought to allow, that something about Josiah Wren's death had never sat right with the fishermen who found him. The county had tried twice to sell the property and failed twice. And now, Bess said with a small, apologetic laugh, they were practically giving it away, $4 structure and land both, to anyone fool enough to want it. Clara asked, quietly, whether anyone had looked inside it recently. Bess said no one much wanted to. The door had been nailed shut for years. Clara walked out to Grieving Point the following afternoon, alone, her boots sinking into wet sand and sea grass, and stood for long while looking up at the tower. White paint peeling to gray, the iron lantern room at its crown clouded with salt and neglect, gulls wheeling around it, as though it were simply another outcropping of stone rather than something men had built and later abandoned. It should have looked pitiful. Instead, standing there with the wind pulling at her shawl and the $11, now $9 after the boarding house, folded in her pocket, Clara felt something she had not felt since before Thomas died, the small, stubborn stirring of purpose. She thought of her mother teaching her to splice rope by lamplight. She thought of every skill Agnes Reyes had insisted a daughter learn, skills that had seemed, for 15 married years, entirely unnecessary. She went to the county clerk the next morning and paid her $4 and walked out holding a deed to a lighthouse that everyone else in Gullhaven considered worthless. And if the clerk thought her foolish, he was polite enough not to say so aloud. The door, when she finally worked it open with a borrowed crowbar and considerably more determination than skill, groaned like something waking from an unwilling sleep, and the smell that met her was of dust and cold stone and the particular mustiness of a place sealed too long from light. The ground floor held little: a rusted stove, a table furred with dust, a narrow bed frame stripped of its mattress. But Clara moved through it slowly, running her palm along the curved stone walls, feeling less like an intruder than like someone being handed a set of hands to shake. She found, tucked in a cupboard, a keeper's logbook, its leather cover swollen with damp, and she carried it to the one window that still let in clean light and began to read. Josiah Wren's handwriting was small and careful, the hand of a man who valued precision, and the early entries were exactly what she expected: weather, oil consumption, ships sighted and logged, the ordinary rhythm of a keeper's duty. But as she turned the pages toward the final months of 1880, the entries changed in a way that made the hair rise on her arms. Wren had begun writing, in a hand grown tighter and more urgent, about a schooner called the Merritt Hollis, owned by a shipping concern out of Portland, and about a night in November when he had watched it steer deliberately toward the rocks below Grieving Point rather than away from them, as though the captain wanted the wreck rather than feared it. He wrote of cargo manifests that did not match what divers later pulled from the wreckage. He wrote, in an entry dated only 9 days before the final page, that he had written to the Maritime Authority in Portland naming names, and that he feared the letter would never reach anyone who wished to read it, because the man he had named, a rising young shipping agent by the name of Silas Crum, had powerful friends in that city and a great deal to lose. The logbook ended there, mid-sentence, on a page half-filled, and Josiah Wren had been found dead at the base of his own tower 3 weeks later, ruled an accident by a coroner who had, Clara would later learn, been paid a visit by that same Silas Crum shortly before delivering his verdict. Clara sat with the logbook in her lap for a long while after finishing it, the gulls crying outside, the cold coming up through the stone floor into her bones, and she understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who has recently learned exactly what men are capable of when they believe no one is watching, that she was holding something far heavier than an old man's private grievance. She was holding proof, incomplete and proven, but proof nonetheless, that a wreck the town still spoke of in hushed voices, a wreck that had drowned 6 fishermen from Gullhaven who had gone out that same night to try to save the Merritt Hollis's crew, had not been an accident of weather at all. And the name Silas Crum nagged at her, because she had heard it before, spoken by Bess Calloway at supper only 2 nights earlier, not as a villain from the past, but as the very man who now owned the cannery, the general store, and most of the fishing rights along that stretch of coast, a respected pillar of Gullhaven's uneasy, diminished present. She climbed the spiral stair to the lantern room the following morning, partly from curiosity and partly, she admitted to herself, because Josiah Wren's careful hand had made her trust that a man so precise about his duties would not have left the story unfinished by accident. The lantern room itself was a marvel of old brass and clouded glass, the great lens still intact though filmed with a decade of salt, and it was there, prying loose a warped floor panel beneath the lens pedestal that did not sit quite flush with its neighbors, that she found the tin dispatch box Josiah Wren had hidden before his death, soldered shut, rusted at the seams, heavier than its size suggested it should be. It took her the better part of an hour with a chisel and a growing, trembling urgency to open it, and when she finally did, in the gray light of that reclaimed lantern room with the wind singing against the glass, she found the second half of the story the logbook had left unfinished. Inside were 3 things. The first was a sealed letter addressed to the Maritime Authority in Portland, the very letter Josiah Wren had feared would never be delivered, detailing in exacting language the deliberate wrecking of the Merritt Hollis, the falsified cargo manifest that had let Silas Crum collect insurance on goods never actually loaded, and the names of 2 other vessels wrecked in suspiciously similar circumstances up and down that same stretch of coast over the preceding 3 years. The second was a small leather pouch containing gold coin. Not a fortune by the standards of a mining town, but a considerable sum for a coastal fishing village fallen on hard times. Savings Wren had apparently set aside from his keeper's salary across 2 decades of frugal, solitary living, with a note in his careful hand explaining that he had no family left to leave it to, and that should anyone ever find this box, he hoped they would use the money to help the town he had quietly loved from, his tower on the point. And the third was a folded map, hand-drawn, marking the wreck sites of the Merit Hollis and the 2 other vessels Wren had named, along with a notation that maritime insurers of that era paid substantial bounties for verified evidence of fraud, bounties that, if claimed properly, could amount to a sum large enough to rebuild a struggling town's entire fishing fleet. Clara sat in that lantern room until the light began to fail, holding evidence that a lonely, careful man had died protecting, and she understood, with a weight that settled into her chest and did not lift, that she now carried a responsibility far larger than the $4 she had paid for it. The trouble began, as trouble in small towns so often does, with whispers before it became words spoken to her face. Clara had not intended to keep her discovery secret. She had gone, within the week, to the county sheriff, a tired, decent man named Otis Farrow, and laid the letter and the logbook before him. And Farrow had gone pale, reading Josiah Wren's account, and had promised to write immediately to the Maritime Authority in Portland to reopen the inquiry. But word travels along a coastline faster than any letter, carried by fishermen and ferrymen and the particular gossip that flows through a general store, and within a fortnight it was known throughout Gullhaven that the widow who had bought the old lighthouse for $4 had found something in the lantern room that named Silas Crum a wrecker and a murderer of sorts, however many years removed. Crum did not deny knowing about the letter for long. He came to Clara himself, on a blustery afternoon, driving up to the lighthouse in a fine trap with a hired man at the reins, and he stood in the doorway of the tower she had scrubbed and aired and begun, slowly, to make her own, and he did not raise his voice any more than Elias Whitfield had, because men like that rarely needed to. He told her that old accusations from a bitter, isolated man proved nothing, that Josiah Wren had been known to drink and to imagine conspiracies in his final years, that she was a stranger to this town with no standing to dredge up old griefs that would only frighten the fishing families who still, whether she realized it or not, depended on the cannery he owned for their livelihoods. He offered her, with the practiced smoothness of a man accustomed to buying his way out of difficulty, $100 for the lighthouse and everything in it, and safe, quiet passage out of Gullhaven, an offer that would have solved every material problem in Clara Whitfield's life in a single afternoon. She thought, standing there with the wind, off the point pulling at her skirts, of Elias Whitfield's voice telling her that grief did not entitle her to charity. She thought of 6 fishermen's names, which she had since learned from Bess Calloway, drowned trying to save a crew that had never truly been in danger, drowned by a captain following Silas Crum's orders. She thought of Josiah Wren, dying alone at the base of his own tower after daring to write one letter too many. And she told Crum, in a voice steadier than she felt, that the lighthouse was not for sale, and that Sheriff Farrow already had copies of everything. The weeks that followed tested her in ways the $11 and the abandoned tower never had. Crum, unable to buy his way past her, turned instead to influence. He leaned on the cannery workers who depended on him for wages, suggesting, without ever quite saying so directly, that continued trouble from the lighthouse woman might mean fewer hours at the cannery come winter. He suggested to the county commissioners, several of whom owed him favors, that Clara's ownership of the lighthouse property might be challenged on a technicality, that the sale had perhaps been improperly conducted. He even, in his quieter and more dangerous moods, let it be known that a woman alone on an isolated point might find the winter storms more perilous than she expected, a suggestion that Bess Calloway relayed to Clara with her jaw tight and her eyes worried, urging her, for the first and only time, to consider taking the $100 and going somewhere safer. Clara did not go. She wrote instead, with Sheriff Farrow's help and Bess Calloway's steady encouragement, to the maritime insurance underwriters named in Wren's letter, laying out the evidence in full, the falsified manifests, the wreck sites marked on Wren's careful map, the pattern of 3 vessels lost under circumstances no honest storm could explain. She spent long evenings by lamplight in the lantern room she had reclaimed and repaired with borrowed tools and her own 2 calloused hands. Cross-referencing dates in the old logbook against newspaper accounts Bess helped her track down from the county archive, building, piece by patient piece, a case too thorough for any commissioner's favor to bury. It was, in its own way, the same work her mother had taught her at 19. The patient splicing together of frayed and broken things until they held weight again. The reckoning, when it came, arrived not as drama, but as the quiet, grinding machinery of consequence finally catching up to a man who had believed himself beyond its reach. Investigators from the Maritime Authority arrived in Gullhaven in the early spring of 1890, drawn by Wren's original letter, now corroborated by Clara's careful documentation, and they found, upon deeper inquiry into Kroom's shipping records, evidence enough not only of the Merritt Hollis fraud, but of the 2 other wrecks Wren had marked on his map. Silas Kroom did not go to prison. The law of that era and that remote county was not always equal to its promises, and Kroom's money bought him a lighter fate than justice might have demanded. But he lost the cannery, forfeited in restitution to cover the insurance fraud, lost his standing among the commissioners who had once owed him favors and now scrambled to distance themselves from him, and left Gullhaven within the year a diminished man. His name spoken afterward with the particular contempt a town reserves for those who mistook fear for respect. Clara used the bounty the underwriters paid for verified evidence of fraud, a sum larger than she had ever in her life expected to hold. Not to leave Gullhaven for somewhere easier, as more than one person gently suggested she might, but to buy the forfeited cannery outright and reopen it under fair wages and honest weight, employing many of the very families who had once feared speaking against Kroom too loudly. She used a portion of Josiah Wren's careful, quiet savings to relight the lantern atop the tower she had bought for $4, restoring it to working order with the help of the county and a grateful fleet of fishermen who no longer had to guess their way past Grieving Point in the fog. And she kept, framed on the wall of the keeper's cottage she made her home, a single page of Josiah Wren's logbook, the one where his careful hand had first grown urgent, as a reminder, to herself and to anyone who visited, that watching carefully and writing it down honestly is its own kind of courage, even when no one is there to see it. We began this story by telling you, plainly, that Clara Whitfield was 42 years old, penniless, and cast out by a man who believed her grief entitled her to nothing. We told you she bought an abandoned, unlucky lighthouse for $4, and that everyone who heard of it thought her a fool. What we did not tell you then, because we wanted you to discover it as she did, was that the very qualities which made her seem foolish to Elias Whitfield and to a town that barely noticed her arrival, her patience, her carefulness, her stubborn refusal to be hurried out of what belonged to her, were the same qualities that led her here in a dead man's careful handwriting, a truth that a whole community had been too afraid to speak aloud for 9 years. She did not restore that lighthouse for wealth, though wealth came to her regardless. She restored it because a lonely keeper had once trusted that someone, someday, would care enough to finish what he started, and because Clara Whitfield, raised by a mother who taught her that a woman should always know how to stand on her own, understood in her bones what it means to be overlooked and to be right anyway. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with us and with Clara. If her story moved you, we hope you will share it with someone who needs a reminder that what looks worthless to everyone else may simply be waiting for the right person to look closer, and we would love it if you would leave a comment telling us this. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of them, and they mean more to us than you know. Until next time, stay close.